a good litmus test is, if a couple of weeks out from, your key Ironman, you can over a weekend do what I call a metric Ironman.
The Triathlon Show 149. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I bring back David Tilbury-Davis, and in this episode we will discuss how to plan your next race. Because as they say, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. But first, big thanks to our sponsors. Precision Hydration can be found on precisionhydration.com, and they produce electrolyte products that you can use to personalize your hydration strategy. And your hydration strategy is one of the important parts that has to go into your race plan, so it is very relevant to this particular episode. And Precision Hydration, you can actually outsource your race prep on the hydration side to Precision Hydration through using their free online sweat test that I'll link to in the episode description and in the show notes. And that's just a simple quiz with a few questions that you'll answer. And then Precision Hydration will tell you how much electrolytes you should consume based on your individual sweat rate and sweat sodium content and the race distance that is your target race. So that is a very useful part of really getting a good detailed hydration strategy as part of your race plan. If you decide to try Precision Hydration's electrolyte products to actually execute this plan, then use the discount code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. This episode is also sponsored by Roka. And by the time you hear this episode, we are very, very soon going to be in Kona for the Ironman World Championships. And some of you listeners I know will be going. I hope that you have some swim skins, but if you don't, it's maybe not too late. You can get yours on Roka, and Roka's swim skin is called the Viper. I have it myself, and it is an absolutely brilliant swim skin. As all Roka products, the amount of R&D and the focus on detail and performance design really becoming the fastest swim skin in the world is really insane. And that is the reason that in 2015, when there was an official swim skin count, Roka had more swim skins than any other brand at Kona. And in unofficial counts that have taken place every year since, Roka do them themselves to make sure they stay ahead of the competition. Roka has been the number one ever since. So that just goes to tell you how good those swim skins are, but the same can be said for their other products like sunglasses, goggles, wetsuits, tri-suits, etc. And you can find all of that on Roka.com, and you can get 20% off your entire order when you use the discount code THATTRIATHLONSHOW, all one word, all caps. All right, so let's just go into the interview with David Tilbury-Davis. So today I welcome back David Tilbury-Davis. How are you today, David?
Good, thanks, Michael.
We have the topic of race planning on the agenda for today. And the first thing that I want to discuss is what elements do you think need to be in a good race plan?
I think the purpose of any race plan is to make sure there's no surprises on race day and in the days leading up to the race. So, you're wanting to cover, aspects of logistics, travel, execution, just to make sure that you can enjoy the day and, also look forward to an outcome that, you're hoping will occur. I'm not suggesting that plans are concrete, but it's good to have a plan.
So can you go into some specifics on those things, the logistics and execution? Like, if you go into a bit more detail on that, what would some examples be?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to look at it is to start, at the very beginning of the moment you sign up for a race, and at that point, any athlete wanting to have the best outcome possible, you want to do as much homework as you can on the actual course. Is a map available? Is, in this day and age, is video footage available? Can you replicate that route on various indoor training platforms? What's the weather going to be like on that day? That can lead to fairly important decisions. What's the travel arrangements necessary for that race? So those are all the things that you can do just to make your life a little bit easier come race day. And from there, you then move into really wanting to understand what you're trying to achieve at that race. I think many athletes sometimes enter a race looking to enjoy the sport, enjoy themselves, and show up on the day with good fitness, having done some good training, but still don't really have a good grasp of what the outcome is likely to be. So you can definitely disappear down a rabbit hole of trying to analyze everything to the nth degree, but I do think there's some basic things that you want to do, like knowing the course, knowing the weather. This allows you to make good equipment choices. It allows you to structure your training in an appropriate way. Understanding, in the context of long distance racing, understanding maybe what sports nutrition is available on the course. Does it suit you? Does it not suit you? Is it something that you want to take advantage of? Do you not want to take advantage of it? If you are going to not take advantage of it, then how are you going to carry, the nutrition that you want during the race? Have you tested that? Is there, can you travel with it? How are you going to travel with it? So those are aspects leading into the race, and for folks that then maybe are starting to be more at the pointy end, it's also then understanding, how the race might play out, and what competitors might be there, if you're looking for some very real success, and doing your homework on that, and then those are all that's the sort of, before you've even sort of traveled to the race, all the homework that you can do, and then as you get nearer, you're looking to then put a plan in place that's much more detailed about the execution and thought processes you're going to have, the sort of mentally preparing yourself for the race. So there's quite a lot there that you can drill down into.
So with that more detailed plan that you make up when you get closer to the race, do you have a process that you go through with the athletes that you coach, or that you would recommend in general for self-coach athletes to take when they do that? Like, when should they do it, and how should they even think about? Should they do it with pen and paper or on a computer? What sort of tips do you have around that?
I think it's important to put down on pen and paper, or in an electronic format that you can refer back to, and you break that down much like a school report. This is the approach that I've learned over the years. It's the approach I've used with professional age group athletes alike, and that report, is a way for athletes to get themselves mentally prepared. It's to give themselves some cues to remind them of their process, and it's a way for them to reflect back afterwards and to learn from moving forward. So, I've got some athletes that have probably been writing, these race plans maybe sort of 15, 20 times, and they still find value in doing it because there's always learnings from the previous race. So you start out by, considering the weather. What's the environment going to be like? How is that going to impact on my choice of kit? A good example would be Cody Beals raced at Ironman Mont Tremblant this a couple of weekends ago. He won the race, but the swim was delayed. One of the things that he picked up through experience was it was potentially going to be a non-wetsuit swim for the pro athletes. but he made the decision to go down to the swim start in his wetsuit and to warm up in his wetsuit. And, that it was a smart decision because it meant he was able to sort of maintain, his core temperature better as the delay took place. So it's important to really understand what are the hurdles that might crop up. For age group athletes, it's a little harder to maybe do that, but certainly I think many races, it's good to have one of those sort of foil survival blankets in the kit that you might take down to the start of the race that you can wrap around yourself to keep warm if something happens, or an old pair of socks to keep your feet warm, or even some gloves to keep your periphery warm. Just an important consideration. And then, the choices that you might make on the day of the race, you might decide to wear toe covers on your shoes or gloves on the bike. All these things can be anticipated if you do some homework on what the conditions are likely to be and what they've been like in the past.
When do you recommend that athletes start with this process of putting together this detailed checklist? How far in advance should it be done?
Normally sort of a week or so before the race, and then they would email it over to me, and then we'd start to sort of review it and analyze it. And I used to many years ago sort of write these race plans out, and I think many coaches do sometimes write race plans out for athletes. I shied away from that several years ago simply because it occurred to me that if I want an athlete to take real ownership and real sort of emotional investment in their plan, it's better if they write that plan themselves. And, concurrent to that, I would say it's important that any athlete understands, if they're working with a coach, that the coach is there to help them write that plan. If they don't have an understanding of things that they should consider, or the pacing strategy, then, of course the coach should step in and offer their wisdom and insight. But really starting to write out that process of things that they might consider, things that they might think about that are very extrinsically orientated or intrinsic sort of considerations of sort of mental keywords, the athlete should definitely write that. So kind of coming back to that plan, they might start writing that about a week or so out from the race. Once they've covered things like the weather, you're then going to get into the swim. And in the swim, they might look at things like focusing on staying on feet, or focusing on a particular rhythm. Not many athletes are aware, but in certainly the WTC Ironman events, it's not illegal to use one of these tempo trainers. Where I've known many an athlete use it with the beep that reminds you of your stroke rate. I've known many an athlete, pro and age group, that's tucked it inside their swim cap and used it to help them settle into a rhythm on the swim stroke. It's not. I'm ambivalent on it. I'm not sort of like you must do that or you mustn't. It's personal preference. But that's there's definitely some cues that they might think to put down on paper, and then alongside that they might think of a single word that they would try to remember with that. So it might be something like smooth, or rhythm, or cadence, and it's much easier for them to remember that one word, in the race, to kind of help themselves reset if any sort of anxiety kicks in, and remind them of that process that they've written out, things to think about. And they then repeat that process for the bike and the run, and they may touch on certain pacing strategies on the bike, and this is where really it's important to understand both the course and what you're looking to achieve and the racing environment that you're in. The pacing strategy for an athlete doing a draft legal Olympic distance race would be very different to your 14-hour age group Ironman athlete and would be very different from, your seeking a podium professional athlete. There's certain sort of strategic and tactical things that might go on or are relevant depending on the individual. And then the same on the run, coming onto the run, an understanding of, what pace, what sensations, what posture are you looking to execute, and having some keywords to remind yourself of that.
It's funny. As you're talking, I'm following along in my most recent race plan that I made for my own racing, which was the Olympic Distance Nationals in Finland. And for the swim, for example, I had 2 words as my focus words, and those were smooth and control. But talking about that pacing strategy a bit, if we dig deeper into that, how do you think that athletes should? How granular should they become with what pacing strategies they have in the different disciplines, and how can they know what is their sustainable pace or power or whatever it may be?
It's quite a deep one. I mean, I think I can tick a few boxes off at the top end. If you have somebody that is, racing at the very top of the game as a professional, or maybe trying to podium at, a world-class event like Kona or a regional championship or even an Ironman, then there is definitely a reality to understand your strengths as an athlete, and that potentially there may be parts of the bike or the swim where you may need to surge to react to certain situations or to set yourself up for more success. It's important to research that and understand that, I think, if you're at the very pointy end. And it would be naive to think that the way to get the best result at that level is, to swim as fast as you can at one speed and bike as fast as you can at one speed and run as fast as you can at one speed. That's what sports science tells us, but the reality is very different at the pointy end for age group and pros alike. And I use the analogy of a poker game that, if you're playing that game, you need to understand the hand that you hold, and you need to understand when to bet and when not to bet and when to bluff. And I think many athletes at the pointy end, have an understanding that they're playing a game of poker, but they don't understand the hand that they hold. And metaphorically, what I'm talking about is, physiologically, what are their capabilities, or, what do they, what do they need to do and react to if they're trying to have the best outcome possible. So that's the pointy end. I think.
Can I make one follow up on that? So do you think there's some sort of threshold for how close to the pointy end you need to be in terms of your time? So maybe you might be at the pointy end in the 60-65 age group, but you're a 5 hour 70.3 athlete. Would you still be using that hand and doing those bluffs, so doing surges when it's appropriate? Or at that speed, is it better to go at a certain pace compared to somebody who's doing a 4:20 half Ironman who is at the pointy end in the 30 to 35 age group?
Well, I think that comes. I think it's not as there's not a requirement to to react as much. I think going back to my point about knowing the competition. If you were a 50-year-old age group athlete looking to achieve success and be on the podium and in a certain event, then I think it would pay to know, to have done your homework on maybe other individuals that are on the start list, that you've raced against, many times. You might have somebody that, you show up to some local races and that they're always a really strong runner. So that at some point you're going to have to deal with that. And how are you physiologically, in terms of being able to react to that? So there are aspects that apply, with individuals whose race time may be a bit slower. But I wouldn't say it's, it occurs as much as it may do for somebody going 420.
Okay, so I'll let you go back to the original question then about pacing.
So then for the majority of individuals, so the reality is that the best physiological outcome that you will have is if you settle into, a good pace on the swim, and you settle into a very even effort or pace or power on the bike, and you settle into a very even pace or effort on the run. How granular you get with that, depends on whether you're racing by feel, whether you're racing by power, whether you're racing by heart rate, whether you're racing by pace. For somebody that is very new to the sport, doesn't have lots of toys, they're simply working on effort, then it's important for them to understand that how they feel at 10 minutes into their half Ironman race is going to be very different on the bike compared to sort of 2 hours into the bike. And so, that's something important to get an understanding of in training of well, how tired do I get if I, go out for a ride and I maintain a fairly even speed, or I maintain a fairly even heart rate. The caveat with heart rate is it is a gauge of effort, but the longer you race, the more cardiac drift you would expect to see for the same amount of mechanical work or power output. So even if somebody is applying even effort over a 3 hour 70.3 bike, you would see the heart rate drift slightly. And so again, you want to be aware of that and not panic about that, and likewise not start out too exuberant.
Because it takes time, of course, for heart rate to get back up to get up to the level where it will stabilize.
Yes.
So what about, so people can obviously Google and have Googled a lot of times these sort of power numbers and heart rate guidelines for especially half Ironman and full Ironman races. And do you think that they are good places to start when people want to form their pacing strategies, or should they actually do specific, I guess, or is it both? Should they go out and do specific testing sessions to see what their individual, more specific, sustainable pace may be?
I think there's a starting point. Let's keep a simple scenario. Somebody buys themselves a power meter. They've entered an Ironman. They Google, what's my pace at Ironman, and they see a million articles on the internet that says 75% of their FTP. I'll be honest with you. In 20 years of coaching, I see really not that many individuals racing an Ironman and running well. That's the caveat. And running well, at that sort of 75-ish% of FTP. That takes an incredibly large amount of fitness and deep amount of fitness. The reality is, for most people, closer to 70% is probably a more sensible starting point. How you might want to test that is, if you are doing a longer bike ride or a longer run, then if you have in your mind a certain pace or a certain power or a certain heart rate that you're going to hold, I think, a good litmus test is, if a couple of weeks out from, your key Ironman, you can, over a weekend, do what I call a metric Ironman. So, an Ironman is 2.4 miles, it's 112 miles and 26.2 miles. If an athlete can, on a Saturday morning, do a 2.4 kilometer swim and a 112 kilometer bike, and on the Sunday do a 26 kilometer run, and do all those, at the pace or the power or the heart rate that they intend to race at, then I think that's a good litmus test. And that's talking about the long distance. I think if you talking a shorter distance, half Ironman, you can probably, sensibly apply the same logic. And if not, if you don't have the capacity to do that, then I think if you're going out for a longer bike ride, if you can manage 50% of that bike ride or 50% of that run at your goal effort or goal pace, you can break that up, slice it up as you see fit. But if you can manage 50% of that, I think that's also a very telling indicator of, are you really being sensible with your pacing strategy? Because the reality is, if you have an idea of what you want to do in, for argument's sake, in a 70.3, and you go out for a 3-hour bike ride and you spend 90 minutes of that ride, at your goal pace, power, heart rate, whatever, you should be able to manage that. If you're intending to race for 2.5, 3.5 hours, you should definitely be able to manage that 90 minutes, at your intended pace.
Yeah, and to add to that, what you said about the Ironman, that very few can do 75%. For the 70.3, we typically see 80 to 85% as the FTP numbers, or percentage of FTP numbers being thrown around. What's your experience of that?
I would say closer, again, for most people, closer to 78 to sort of 80% is probably more realistic.
Yeah.
And some people may not have access to doing these sorts of, using devices, using GPS devices, using power. They may be just doing everything on feel. And then I think it would be important to understand, have a good sense of, what your aerobic and anaerobic thresholds are. And the easy way to do that is to look at your ability to talk. If you go for a run and, you're running along and you're comfortably able to hold a conversation, you can talk in full sentences, you're definitely operating aerobically. If you start to get to a point that maybe in the midst of a sentence, you're sort of gasping for air, or taking a breath, pausing for breath is the phrase I use, then you're very definitely at or around sort of aerobic threshold. Once you kind of start to go quicker than that and you get to a point that you don't want to speak, then you're definitely at sort of anaerobic threshold. And that's not sort of strange coaching wisdom. There's science that sits behind that that looks at the ability to talk and how it relates to exercise intensities. And so if you're in a race, if you're an age group athlete and you're or a professional athlete and you're in a long distance event and you're pushing such that you can't talk, then you're almost certainly going too hard.
Excuse me. So that's very good advice on the pacing side. If we go into the run a little bit as well,
Yes.
on the pacing, I think that's where it gets even more interesting, because then you already have the bike in your legs. So I think there's a bigger divergence in what people can do, and of course there's quite some mispacing probably on the bike as well, which causes this. But what's your take on the run, if you just generally describe the thought process that people should have for pacing the run?
For pacing the run, I think you have to understand, the distance that we're racing over. Would it be Olympic distance? Would it be half? Would it be an Ironman? And then how familiar with that are you? Have you done many brick sessions? I think brick sessions can serve a purpose. I think, epic brick sessions definitely don't serve a purpose. I think they can, take a very large toll on somebody. And what I mean by that is, I've seen, coaches, repetitively prescribe athletes that are doing Ironman with, 5-6 hour bike rides followed by a 2-hour run. I mean, that's just patently ridiculous in my book. I think if you can if you could run off the bike for a maximum of an hour off a 3-hour bike, and you can, settle into a rhythm and see very little heart rate, cardiac drift, practice your nutrition on the bike and the run, then, that would be more than ample and more than telling that, you've got your planning right for an Ironman. For an Olympic distance, interestingly, practicing transitions can be hugely important. And there was actually a study done on professional triathletes where they looked at the disconnect between their performance in the run and their effort on their bike and their run pace through transition. And what they actually found was that the athletes who sprinted like crazy through T2 didn't seem to run as well over the ensuing 10K as athletes that ran through T2 at a heart rate or an effort that was a little bit below threshold. And likewise, the people that just slowly jogged through T2 again didn't run as well as they should. I thought that was quite an interesting study on real world athletes. That it's great thinking about the swim and the bike and the run, but actually you also, certainly short distance racing, the transitions are hugely important and should be practiced.
Yeah, and that, I don't know if that's the same study, but I remember one as well that looked at the 10K pace in relation to elite Olympic distance triathletes in relation to their open 10K pace, and they found that the triathletes that in the first 1 kilometer of the 10K run in the triathlon held 90% of their open 10K pace and then settled into 95% or so for the rest of the run. They did much better than the runners that held a pace that was significantly above 90% of their open 10K pace in that first kilometer.
Yeah, it was the same study.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's very interesting, and yes, definitely agree with you as somebody myself who focuses mostly on the short distance, that transition training is very, very, very important for that type of racing, and learning how to settle into a pace and not go overboard, because if it sounds short, quote unquote, in relation to an Ironman or a half Ironman, but it's still going to be a pretty long run at the end of the day. So you need to get that pacing right, or it can be very ugly at the end.
I think any athlete, certainly touching on the transitions, I think any athlete, there's certain planning aspects that you want to take care of. When you go to a race and you rack your bike, I think any good athlete, you should walk the route that you're going to be, running on the swim, and that you're going to be running coming off the bike and going out on the run, to familiarize yourself with it. The number of athletes that, I've heard of that have kind of got all sort of, get their directions wrong, when they're under duress in the race, or they fumble their shoes or their helmet because they're sort of 6s and 7s of where they are and what they're doing. You can make your life a lot easier that when you get there to make sure exactly where you've got to go and what you've got to do, and preparing your bike setup or your transition bags, just making sure that you've got everything ready and sensibly laid out or set up. You don't want to be that athlete that suddenly decides the day before the race that you're going to have a go at a flying mount when you've never practiced that. I've had professional triathletes that I've told that initially what they should do is put their cycling shoes on and clip-clop through transition and get on their bike in a way that they're comfortable with in a long distance race, because they just haven't had enough practice or paid attention to how they're going to mount the bike. On the other end of that, as you come out of transition, and maybe you are somebody that's doing a flying mount on the bike, and then you're putting your shoes on because they're already clipped on the bike. Then it's a case of understanding the course. do you want to be that person that, crosses the line coming out of transition and then sort of slowly steps over their bike, puts one foot on one shoe, and then takes half a pedal stroke and then puts one foot on the other shoe, and then starts pedaling, gets up to a little bit of speed, and then slowly try to put one foot in, and repeating the process with the other foot? Or, is it safer and wiser to, have practiced that, jump on the bike, start pedaling with your feet on top of your shoes, and then wait 3 or 4 minutes until you've got away from people leaving transition before you start thinking about putting your feet into your shoes? That can be the difference at the in professional racing. That can be the difference between making a group and not making a group.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about nutrition and the planning for nutrition.
Yes.
What should go into that planning?
I think the nutrition is an interesting one at the moment. We've seen a big, argument to, go low carb, high fat, or keto, and you don't really need, many carbs. You can train your body to be more fuel efficient. That's great if you're taking sort of 16 hours to do an Ironman. But the reality is, there's a 20, 30, 40 years of sports science that clearly shows that if you want to go fast, you need glycogen. So, for any athlete, they should have a good understanding of, firstly, what does their palate like? Do they like, do they prefer sports drink? Do they prefer a gel? Do they prefer a bar? Do they prefer a combination of that? Do they prefer real food, a peanut butter and jam sandwich, or a rice cake? Not a dry rice cake, the sort of, made with sushi rice cake. All these things can be practiced over and over again. And there's also evidence that shows that the gut is trainable. You can train the gut to deal with calories. It's clear, we know that, a sensible starting point is maybe, 1 gram per kilogram body weight of carbohydrate per hour. And that may vary slightly depending on how fast somebody is.
So to give an example for people that can't really relate to that, if you're a 75 kilogram male, that would be roughly 3 gels per hour.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that would be 75 times 4 divided by 100. Most gels are about 100 calories.
Yeah.
So, and I think also as well, there's a danger many individuals look at what the pros are doing, and I would say don't look at what the pros are doing, simply because some pros are freaks of nature in terms of their capacity to metabolize carbohydrate. And how also how resilient their gut is. I've known athletes that have raced Ironmans using 1 bottle filled with 25 gels on the bike, and I've known people have complex sports nutrition drink mixes and bars and chews, and it varies completely. I think but the absolute key is you train your body. You practice this.
So this really is one of those aspects that you need to put in place quite early, and not just the week before the race, but you need
Absolutely.
to know way in advance how much you want to consume on race day so that you can train it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen people also, just practice things, and then going back to the weather, go to a race where it's really, really hot, and suddenly they get really thirsty, and so they're like, I've got to grab more fluids on the course. So they grab more fluid, they grab more sports drink, and suddenly they forget that they're now pushing more calories down, and then they get distended and bloated because they've taken on too many calories and not enough water, and they also haven't trained their stomach to deal with the sort of gastric emptying rate that's required to deal with that amount of carbohydrate intake and fluid intake. So it's just know where you're racing, know what's required, and use that as a starting point and go from there. I wouldn't want to sit here and say, look, this is a golden rule of thumb that applies to everybody. But I think, a starting point of, 1 gram per kilogram body weight per hour of carbohydrate is a sensible starting point.
Yeah, and then you alluded to it already with the palette of the athlete and the different choices they have with gels and chews and sports drinks, but that's something to point out, that it's that if you in training consistently consume gels, but then you go to on race day consuming only bars, that's going to be a different type of digestion that you need to do, or it will take a different toll on your digestive system. So it's important to have that specific type of calories that you will consume as well in your plan and in your training before the race.
Yeah. And, and sort of relatedly to the nutrition is also sort of, sweat rate and, loss of electrolytes and replacement of electrolytes. There isn't really a hard and fast rule, and any manufacturer or person that says, this is, this is a rule on how much sodium you should have. There isn't a hard and fast one. You see such wildly varying sweat rates between individuals. I've seen data on individuals where they have a very high sweat rate with a very low loss of sodium. I've seen completely the opposite of that. I've seen people that have a very low sweat rate with very low sodium loss, and people with a very high sweat rate with a very high sodium loss. That's a very personal thing. I think if you're finding in your long distance races that the back end of the bike, you sort of cardiovascularly feel like you're doing, perfectly all right, but you just feel that your muscles just don't really seem to be firing very well, then that's almost certainly an indication that you're probably lacking some electrolytes. And that would be a lesson there that you probably want to take a little bit more on board. How much, unless you've done a sweat test, it's very difficult to say. But it's something you can definitely practice sort of iteratively in the same way that you practice your nutrition.
I have to plug our sponsor, Precision Hydration here. They have an online sweat test, which gives a good ballpark number based on questions, like a quiz. How much do you qualitatively sweat, and do you have like salt stains on your clothes and your helmet straps after workout? So they give some ballpark numbers based on those types of questions.
That's definitely a good start. It's definitely a good start, and it definitely helps. And it's also remembering that if you live as we do in more sort of northern hemisphere, and then we go and race somewhere that's more southern hemisphere and hotter, that there is going to be an increase in sweat rate, and that may be something that you actually need to train and practice. You may need, if you're training indoors, you may need to close the door on the room, turn the fans off, have an idea of how hot and humid it gets in the room, and try to replicate, the training environment, the racing environment you're going to be in.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the mental preparation as well. What's your recommendations for that side?
It comes back to that race plan. Somebody's sat down, written out a process. That process has got certain keywords in it or key phrases, and then they use those keywords to remember those and remind themselves of their process that they're trying to execute. And then, in terms of dealing with, the mental aspects of racing, there's almost inevitably in long distance racing, there's going to come sort of a dark patch. I think, one needs to accept that will happen. At that point, that's not the point to start questioning your training. That's the point to start going through sort of what English people would call like an MOT that you would get on a car. Am I drinking? Am I staying on top of my nutrition? Is my cadence nice and fluid, on the bike? Is my breathing, relaxed or labored? Just going over that self-check pattern to sort of recenter yourself and remind yourself of what you need to do and when you need to do it. Lots of athletes deal with anxiety. I think sometimes age group athletes or athletes new to the sport, get very anxious prior to the swim, and they feel very alone in that. And the reality is everybody feels that. I think in one sense that presence of anxiety, it's a good thing. It means that you're sort of emotionally invested in what you're trying to do. What you want to use maybe that anxiety or stress to do is to act a little bit like a laser and sort of make you sort of focus down and inwards into the sensations and the feelings that you've had positively in a training session or a previous race, to remind yourself how you felt. I think that's the key. I think sometimes people talk about this reflecting back when you're in moments of stress, and they say, think about a time when you felt really relaxed, or when you had a really good race. And what I actually sort of expand on that and say to people is actually reflect back to when you had that experience, and actually the sort of the thought processes and that you were going through at that point, and think about that rather than the actual outcome.
Yeah, I think personally for me, that's the absolute most important part of any race plan that I make, that going through workouts and previous races in the build-up and finding those the best of the best of the best and listing them out in the race plan, and then going to them, reflecting back to them when in the actual race situation, and trying to replicate that feeling. That for me is what works the best when it comes to trying to make sure that the execution is good and positive at all times in the race, even when I go through a rough patch.
Well, and I think I'd add to that for some people, a word it is not as powerful as a sound. I had one athlete who would find that a particular song would elicit much more positive emotion and drive. And we've all, I'm sure, listened to music when we've gone for a run or done a bike session that maybe kind of gets you really fired up, puts the hairs standing up on the back of your neck. And if you have that particular song, having that song in your head and having that song go round and round, can be a very positive thing. It doesn't have to be a particular word or a particular phrase or a particular motivation. There's many a story of people that race for a cause that's deeply emotional to them. If we just look at for those people that follow cycling, if you just saw any interviews with Rusty Woods, who just won a stage of the Vuelta in Spain, it was pretty emotional to listen to him talk after winning that race about what he's gone through personally, and that was a driving motivation for him.
Yeah. I want to go back to something that I should have asked earlier when we talked about run pacing, but since we talked a little bit about the starting point numbers in terms of pacing for the bike, let's do that for the run as well. Maybe in particular we can focus on the long distance, but if you have some short distance for not necessarily the elite level, because that's going to be basically based on what you have left and trying to follow the competition, but for the age groupers, what sort of pacing guidelines, whether you use pace or heart rate, would you use as starting points?
I mean, there's not a certain, to my mind, there's not a certain sort of percentage of heart rate that I would say, this is what you should be running at. I mean, I think if you've done an open 10K or 10 miler, then, all things being equal in terms of your training and your fitness, I think if you were to race an Olympic distance and be able to run at 90% of that pace, that would be, a pretty impressive performance in an Olympic distance. I think if you were able to run at 80% of that in a half, and 68 to 70% of that in a full, then that would be really quite a good reflection of fully sort of rounded sort of fitness. But I think that's a very hard and fast rule that doesn't really apply. I mean, for many age groupers, you see that actually their long endurance runs sometimes are run at a quicker pace than they actually run in their Ironman. So, from my point of view as a coach, what I'm trying to understand is, mechanically, what are we trying, and neurologically, what are we trying to prepare ourselves for? There's no sense going out and doing, sort of 10-minute mile, endurance runs. If you anticipate your Ironman marathon is going to be, done at 11-minute miles, or sort of a larger differential, you need to prepare your body for the pace that you're planning to execute.
So perhaps the takeaway there is that one of the things that you mentioned about the if you can do half the duration in training, like for the half Ironman, if you could do what did we talk about, 10 kilometers, or did we talk about?
Yeah, so if you were going to do a half. If you're going to do a half Ironman and, your coach or yourself, you've decided, okay, I'm going to, my long run is going to be sort of a 90-minute run, then, if I can do 45 minutes of that run comfortably with very little heart rate, drift, at the pace that I intend to run in the race, then that's a good reflection of the fact that you're reasonably prepared.
But you're saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be as a brick run. It can be in a standalone run.
No, it can be. I think it can be in a standalone run. I mean, it would be better if it was in a brick run, but I would never prescribe a 90-minute brick. So, I think if it was an hour, it would probably be better to do, sort of a longer ride, a 2 to 3 hour ride, and then an hour run off the bike, and for that to be realistically 45 minutes of that hour to be at kind of goal pace.
Yeah.
For an Ironman or for a half Ironman.
I tend to have the main simulation and pace testing workout that I do is a 45-minute brick at 70.3 intensity or pacing. And at least for the athletes that are running their half marathon in a 70.3 at 1:45, so 1 hour 45 minutes or faster, that seems to be a good predictor of what they can do in the race.
I think many people are, they're looking for, what's this test I can do? What's this formula I can use? And I think people forget that training is testing and testing is training. And that's why, I'm maybe being a little bit evasive in saying, this is the heart rate that you should do, on your run in an Ironman or a half, or this is the test that you should do. It's like, well, not really. I think reality is that there's certain training sessions that you can do that are, for want of a better phrase, a litmus test of your fitness. And if you can repeat those litmus tests a couple of times a year, on top of your racing, then, that gives you a very clear indication that, you're progressing and you're doing things right, or your coach is doing things right. I'm a big believer in sort of litmus test, training sessions where it's not like, okay, we are going to do a time trial, or we're going to measure your VO2 max in the lab and calculate a percentage of that, because there's so many factors that go into the race in terms of, hydration, nutrition, pacing, terrain, that, it's better to have a real world sort of litmus test of that than, go with a very sort of formulaic response.
Yeah, and I think once you get a bit racing experience, at least, again, personally, my experience is that I run the best when I don't look at my watch at all. I just settle into an RPE-based rhythm that I can sustain, and that is something that you learn with training sessions as well, but especially with racing, what that is, and that's, for me, is something that gives me much better runs than if I were to try to hold a certain pace that I had predetermined before the race.
Yeah, absolutely. Because exactly what you're doing there is you're anchoring that effort in experiences that you've had in training. So again, it's very difficult to say to any athlete, this is how you should feel on this race, on the run in this race, because unless they've anchored that sensation in training sessions, it's very difficult for them to kind of actually contextualize that.
Yeah. So, final question.
Yes.
What are the situations when it makes sense to divert from the plan? And conversely, how can athletes that tend to divert unnecessarily from the plan make sure that they actually stick to it and not divert from it and then suffer at the end of a race?
Let's start with the first one. When to diverge from the plan. I mean, I think if you find yourself in a racing situation that you haven't experienced before, I think asking yourself some questions of how you feel, what does your effort feel like? What does your heart rate look like? What does your power look like if you're on the bike? And use those as sort of barometers of your decision making. And if the feedback that comes back is, heart rate is okay, maybe a bit low, and RPE is a bit low, and power is a bit high, then great, crack on. Maybe deviate from your plan a little bit. I think the reality is you never see people deviating from, a plan more than sort of plus or minus 5%. I mean that in a more general sense, not like 5% of this number, this power number, but more, the point I'm making is when people do deviate, it's small deviations with intelligent decision making. It's not toss the plan out the window and start running at my open 10K pace, in the middle of my half marathon in a 70.3. And I think you see that in many races. Coming back to that point about learning how to play poker, you see many athletes sometimes just throw their plan out the window and get caught up in the race experience, and then everything starts to unravel. I mean, I think you have to have a plan. One athlete came to me from a previous coach, and they'd been training with that person for some time, and they'd come to an Ironman, and they were fairly detail orientated, and they said to the coach, right, what do I do? And the coach just said, just go out there, be awesome, go as fast as you can. And they were like, well, that's great. What does that actually mean? Just go out there and just crush it, be awesome. And I was like, well, that doesn't really help me. So I think you definitely need to have a clear set of numbers or paces or heart rates or powers, and then understand that, maybe a little bit of deviation from that is okay under the circumstances. And if you find yourself in a situation where you are having to deviate from that plan, let's take the example of a run where somebody starts to feel like they're struggling to maintain the pace that they wanted to hold. Again, going through that MOT of, am I staying hydrated? Am I staying on top of my nutrition? What's the weather like? If it's suddenly they're at a very hot race, try not to get too wrapped up in, when I'm slowing down, so I'm having a bad day, because the reality could be that, everybody is slowing down and you're actually not slowing down the most. And that's important to remember that, until you cross that finish line, the race isn't over. So even if you are having to make those decisions, don't judge yourself for them, because everybody could be in the same position.
Yeah. And I guess one of the takeaways there as well is that if you have to deviate more than 5% in that general sense, then maybe you didn't do your homework enough. You didn't in training do these sort of workouts that would test what you're capable of to run off the bike, for example, and what the sustainable power on the bike or heart rate.
I don't think for any good athlete that's preparing for a race, I used right at the beginning, I said, trying to create a situation where you're avoiding any surprises. It shouldn't be too surprising in a race to have a certain performance. there's definitely, it's sport and it's long distance racing at times. Even Olympic distance is 2 hours, so it's a long endurance event. There's still some differences that you might see in somebody, exceeding, their expectations, but that isn't going to be, stratospherically different to, maybe what their expectations of outcome were. It may be subtly different. They may have found that extra gear, on the run, to win the race, that they'd never really quite pushed the limits on, and it took the race environment to truly discover that. But that's not going to be, stratospherically different to, the original plan. And I think that's important to remember, is never expect on race day some sort of, magical sprinkling of, unicorn dust, to make you a rock star, because it just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
Jan Frodeno's 106 at the 70.3 World Championships is probably a good example of that, where that's probably a performance for the ages, and we know now that maybe that came at a certain price, maybe it didn't, but that's a performance for the ages. I mean, that was something really special to witness. But I'm sure leading into that, himself and his coach had a sense that maybe they were going to put together something fairly special, but just didn't know what it was.
Yeah. Okay, so this has been really great, David. And for the rapid fire questions, we refer the listeners back to your previous appearance on the podcast in episode 53. So thank you for this. And the listeners that want to find out more about you and your coaching services, you can be found on tilburydaviscoaching.com. Is that it?
www.tilburydavis.com.
Tilburydavis.com. Okay. And you're now in my old neck of the woods in Helsinki, is where you're located.
Indeed. Yes. I've moved to Helsinki for family. Was previously living in the US, but still sort of traveling the world and working with various athletes.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you on.
My pleasure.
Hope that you enjoyed that interview. It was a long one, and time just flew by when I was talking with David. It was so much fun. I really enjoyed this discussion, and I think it was incredibly valuable. So that's the reason why it ended up being such a long interview. That's not something that was planned, really, but it just ended up being that way. But I still think that everything is very, very relevant, and it was worth taking the time to do this interview properly and make it a longer episode in this case. My key takeaways, really the one thing from this discussion, all of these things in the race plan are important. So I don't want to bring out some one particular item. I just want to say once again that, as I said at the front of the episode, that if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. If you have an important race coming up, there's absolutely no excuse not to create a race plan. You're setting yourself up for failure if you don't. That's not to say that you are absolutely for certain going to be a world beater if you do have a race plan, but that's what you need to do to give yourself the best possible chance. My second takeaway is not related to this interview, because it actually occurred in the post-interview chat that David and I had. We discussed some of the concepts that we covered back in episode 53 when David was first on. That one I'll link to in the episode description and in the show notes. It's called Training Talk, Splicing Workouts, Cognitive Load, and More with David Tilbury-Davis. And what we talked about was this concept of splicing workouts. And I had kind of forgotten about this whole thing. But in a nutshell, it means leaving it up to the athlete on the day how they splice the workout. Let's say I want you to be doing 16 minutes of hard work, and I want you to do that on 12 minutes total recovery. So I could basically tell you to do 4 by 4 minutes on 3 minutes recovery, or I could tell you to do 16 by 1 minute on 45 seconds recovery. And depending on the type of athlete you are, you might react very differently to those different types of workouts. So this concept of splicing workouts is something that you can apply even if you are self-coached as well. You can take the work duration and the recovery duration and splice it up in different ways, the way that you might get the most out of the workout itself. So that's in a nutshell what it is, but definitely go back and listen to episode 53 to hear more about it. But that's just something that we during our post-interview workouts talked about, and I think it's such an interesting concept that's not talked much about that I wanted to bring that up again. As usual, you can find the show notes for this episode on thattriathlonshow.com. I'll link to it also directly in the episode description. If you have comments or questions, leave them in the comment section at the bottom of that show notes page. Also, on Thursday, if you didn't listen into the podcast, I introduced or reintroduced Q&As to this podcast. So that was a Q&A episode. And so definitely go and listen to that and let me know what you think. How often should I do this? Should I do them at all? Etc. And of course, if you have questions that you want me to answer on future Q&A episodes, feel free to send them in to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And I'll put them in the backlog to answer on an upcoming Q&A episode. All right, so there is a lot of really great stuff coming up on the podcast. I have a few tentatively scheduled episodes that I don't want to confirm just yet, but there are good episodes coming up, I can tell you that. So definitely subscribe if you aren't already subscribed. If you are a long-time listener, you've been with me for a long time. Have you left a rating and review on iTunes or Apple Podcast yet? Or Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast, really? If you haven't, consider doing that. It really helps to bring the podcast up in the rankings and help it reach more people, which allows me to justify spending the time I do on creating this podcast. Big thanks finally to the sponsors that keep this show alive. First, we have Roka that you can find on roka.com. That's where you should go whenever you want to shop a wetsuit, sunglasses, goggles, tri-suits, swim skins, etc. And you can do that for 20% off when you use the discount code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps. And a big thanks to Precision Hydration for your hydration needs and your electrolyte needs. Go and check out precisionhydration.com and use the promo code ThatTriathlonShow, all one word, all caps, to get your first box for free. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.